Hello, I'm Mariam Mashiri, live from the Qatari capital Doha. It's day 14 of the US-Israel war with Iran. Over the next 30 minutes, we'll bring you our special programme looking at the key developments from today and the first 2 weeks of the war. The US threatens to ramp up air attacks once again. Israel carries out a fresh wave of strikes with blasts heard in Tehran. Israel pounds Hezbollah targets in Lebanon, expanding the scale of its bombing campaign while forcing hundreds of thousands of people to leave their homes. Iran continues to threaten its neighbours with drone attacks, causing chaos in the region. This was the scene in Dubai's financial hub a few hours ago. 6 members of the US military are killed after a refuelling plane crashes in western Iraq. And a remarkable policy U-turn. The US loosened sanctions on Russian oil as security fears grow over one of the world's most important shipping routes. Well, over the coming minutes, we'll be live with our correspondents across the region and around the world. We'll have analysis from our specialists in our London newsroom. Well, as we take a look at the defining moments of a second week of war and the impact it's all having on the world. Well, let's start with that US warning of another lethal day in the war as Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth threatened to launch the highest volume of strikes yet with the aim of decimating Iran's military. Speaking at the Pentagon, Pete Hegseth said attacks would keep escalating.
From day one, as our nation expects and the president demands, our warriors have fought with lethality, precision, and rapid innovation. In fact, today will be, yet again, the highest volume of strikes that America has put over the skies of Iran and Tehran. The number of sorties and number of bomber pulses, the highest yet, ramping up and only up.
Let's speak now to Sumi Somaskanda. And Sumi, what's the Trump administration's view of how this war is unfolding?
Mariam, we've been hearing again from President Trump today that he sees this U.S. military mission in Iran as a complete success. Yet, at the same time, the picture of when President Trump sees this war coming to an end is still very much unclear. Also, the picture of how the Trump administration plans to deal with the Strait of Hormuz being blocked by Iran, and also those strikes on Gulf nations that are allies of the U.S. Now, President Trump did speak to Fox News in an interview earlier today. He said that Iran's Navy, its Air Force, have been obliterated, that its missile program and its missile launchers have been nearly obliterated. He also talked about efforts to damage and destroy Iran's drone program. As you've been mentioning in the program already, we know that those drones have been used in attacks on those Gulf nations across the region. And he did say, I'll just quote him, he said, "We've already damaged them so badly, it would take years for them to ever rebuild. And we're going to be hitting them very hard over the next week." So, Mariam, that gives us a bit of a time scale there. But when he was asked about when the war would end, he said, "When I feel it in my bones." So that might give us some sort of indication that the president right now, clearly not ready to say this war is over, the mission has been completed, but at the same time saying that the U.S. has largely achieved what at this moment appears to be the objectives.
And Sumi, where is public sentiment on the war right now?
We do have a number of polls that have come out in the last 5 days or so, and most of them indicate that the majority of Americans do not support this war. Many of them indicating that they believe this war could make Americans less safe. Of course, there's also the concern over rising oil prices because of the instability in oil and gas markets. And that is something that is driving up prices at the pump here in the U.S., something that voters are not particularly happy about. And I found it particularly interesting to see a poll from the New York Times that compared popular opinion on wars that America has been involved in over several decades now, including Afghanistan and Iraq. And looking at that, this was the least popular war that the U.S. has been involved in at this point. So it's hard to say where that will head. If this war comes to a swift end, that could change, Mariam, but the opinion at the moment is not in support.
Sumi, thank you. Well, Pete Hegseth said that Iran now has no functioning air force, air defence or navy, and that its missile supplies are down by 90%. But Iran has continued to send drones at its neighbours, the oil-rich Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Well, joining me now is Mikey Kay, military analyst for the Security Brief. And Mikey, almost 2 weeks into the war, where do things stand in terms of the military campaign?
Mariam, yeah, hi. For me, the story of this entire war so far is all about cost-benefit ratios. If we look at Iran's asymmetric threat, for example, and what I mean by asymmetry is low cost, mass-produced and very simple military capability that isn't necessarily designed to destroy, but rather damage or degrade in order to provide longevity, to draw the war out. This is where it's at. So what do I mean by asymmetric threat? We can take a look at here some of Iran's asymmetric threats. They got go fast. Go fast means basically fast attack craft. Very agile, very nimble. Here we go, we can see it on screen. And quite hard to detect, especially, Mariam, when they're in swarms. If we look at the Shahed 136 threat, this is a drone. I think we've got a picture here of the drone. It's about $35,000. It can travel at 120 miles an hour. And again, as a singleton aircraft, then you're looking at something that's quite easy to take out. If you're looking at swarms of aircraft, it becomes much more problematic. And then, Mariam, we've obviously got the issue of mines. Not very sophisticated, but if mines are put in the water, wherever it is, whether it's in the Gulf of Oman or the Persian Gulf or around Karg Island, it's then up to the US to be able to determine whether there are mines there or not. And that is very time, manpower and sophistication resources that actually go into that. If we look, so that basically is an example of a low cost benefit ratio. If we look at a high cost benefit ratio, we can see the cost that it actually requires in order to try and take out these threats. You're looking at things like a $35,000 Shahed with a 4 million Patriot missile, looking at a terminal high air defense missile, that's 13 million, and then an advanced short range air-to-air missile, that's 300,000. But that requires an aircraft in the air, it requires a tanker to refuel the aircraft. So it's not just about a $300,000 missile, it's about the support network that it costs in order to get that missile off, which is taking out of Shahed. So the cost-benefit ratios, Mariam, for me, are the principal thing here that the Trump administration have to take into account when they're talking about victory and not drawing this war out.
Mikey, great insight, thank you. Well, it's been a massively volatile week for the world economy, with oil prices fluctuating wildly as Iran threatened the security of those ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz. In a bid to restore calm to the global energy market, the US has made a remarkable policy U-turn, loosening sanctions on Russian oil. Well, Faisal Islam is our economics editor. Faisal, looking back on what's been a volatile week for the global markets, will this latest move be enough?
Well, it is an extraordinary move, as you say. President Putin benefiting, frankly, from the lock-in of ships and of oil production and gas production in the Gulf. And it does seem as if Russia it will benefit in terms of revenues. There's tens of millions of barrels of oil in the Russian shadow fleet on the high seas, and it's purchases from that that are going to be kind of permitted temporarily for a month, I think, in the market. Some expectation that that might be extended in some way. Other world leaders, including, of course, Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine, but also Friedrich Merz, the Chancellor of Germany, have criticised the move as essentially rewarding the Russians at a time when these sanctions were designed to pressurise them to stop the war in Ukraine. But nonetheless, it hasn't hugely impacted on the price of crude oil. That actually has gone up today. Probably the bigger impact on the oil markets today has been, I think, the sense from the press conference that you've just been talking about from the Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth that there is going to be a further intensification of this war with Iran. What the oil market is looking for is when, if you like, the lock-in of tens of millions of barrels of oil in the Gulf, when that is going to end. And the idea that this will continue for weeks, several weeks, is probably the determining factor. That being passed on in petrol prices around the world, in jet fuel prices, but also impacting markets for sulfur, impacting markets for fertilizer through urea. So problematic in terms of this wave of inflation still emanating from the Gulf and going around the world. And $100 barrel oil is back again and looks set to stay for some time yet.
Faisal, thank you. Well, as you might expect, the decision to ease sanctions on countries buying Russian oil has been welcomed by the Kremlin, but has sparked deep concern among Ukrainians. Let's go to James Landale in Kiev. And James, how's the war being viewed by the governments of Russia and Ukraine right now?
Well, not surprisingly, Miriam, the Russians are sort of rather unexpectedly looking up at the moment because, as Faisal just explained, their coffers in the Kremlin are going to be filling much faster than they anticipated, and that means that they will be able to buy more weapons, more drones to threaten the skies above me in coming months. In recent months and weeks, the Russians had been slightly on the back foot. They were struggling financially. They were struggling to recruit enough soldiers to compensate for the huge casualties that they are still suffering on an almost daily basis, about 1,000 casualties every day. Getting this money now will be an unexpected windfall and will effectively get Russia off the hook. In terms of the Ukrainians, well, there's, I have to say, blinking slightly at the moment. On the one hand, you've got this massive war in the Middle East that's distracting the world from supporting them here in this conflict. They know that in the Middle East, an awful lot of air defense missiles are being fired off, and that's going to make it much harder for them to come here to protect these skies. The one sort of shaft of light, if you may like it, for the Ukrainians is this simple fact. Ukraine is a world leader on cheap interceptor drones to defend countries against incoming Iranian-designed Shaheds. And that means that Gulf countries, the Europeans and the Americans, are knocking on Ukraine's door saying, give us your drones, give us your expertise. And what that does is that gives President Zelensky and the Ukrainian government a way of staying relevant to the conversation and catching global attention. So a mixed view at the moment.
James, thank you. Well, Iran faces a wave of fresh strikes as US Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth claims the new supreme leader is likely wounded and disfigured. Despite issuing a statement yesterday, the Iranian leader has not appeared in public since assuming the country's top post. Well, plenty of people on the BBC's YouTube account have been asking what we can read into the fact we haven't seen him. BBC Persian and our teams in the Middle East have gathered messages from Iranians inside the country reacting to the Supreme Leader's first message. They've been voiced by our colleagues.
It was surprising he did not release even a voice message. And to me, it raised some serious doubts about his condition rather than bringing any clarity.
I don't even think it was his message. I think it shows that control of the country is in the hands of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard.
I think the message proved that in many ways the Islamic Republic, no matter who its leader, will always stick to its own beliefs. So the world should know that it can never deal with this regime.
Let's get some more analysis now from our correspondent Siavash Ardalan. Siavash, what are you hearing from people on the ground inside Iran?
Well, in terms of where the supreme leader is or the state of his health is exactly as we heard from the voiceovers we had from inside Iran. But in terms of the attacks, what the U.S. Defense Secretary said today, that tonight is going to be the most intense attacks, that will destroy their Navy, destroy their Air Force, 90% of their ballistic missiles and so on. This is exactly what he said yesterday and the day before and the day before that. So for many Iranians, this war is more about regime change than anything else. It's not about nuclear programs. It's not about ballistic missiles. If you're a pro-regime supporter, it's about how long the regime can resist, how long it can endure these attacks. And if you're an opponent of the regime, you're hoping that these attacks might lead to regime change. So many Iranians, as the war progresses, and every night they're seeing these intense attacks just on military infrastructure, leaving them wondering where this all is going to end and whether there's anything better to come. If they're an opponent of the regime, hoping that when will the moment come when Israel and the US would say, okay, people of Iran, over to you. Now it's safe for you to go out in the street and protest and overthrow the regime. A prospect that many Iranians are now questioning, given that the regime seems quite resilient and quite resistant to these bomb attacks as far as it's concerned existentially.
Siavash, thank you. Well, while the Israeli military is continuing its strikes on Iran and Lebanon, the country is facing attacks on its own territory, with Tel Aviv and other areas in the north targeted by Iranian missile strikes. Let's go to Jerusalem and our correspondent John Donison, who is there for us. And John, 2 weeks in, what is the view from Israel on how the war is unfolding?
Well, I thought your military analyst earlier gave some fascinating analysis, really, because he's right. This is an asymmetric conflict. So for 2 weeks, as you say, Israel has been pounding Iran and Hezbollah in Lebanon, and you can see the asymmetry in terms of the casualties in those countries and the damage that Israel is inflicting. But the Iranians are using what they have efficiently and effectively, and they have clearly succeeded in making this a regional conflict. Now, in terms of how Israel's being hit with Iran and Hezbollah's retaliation, again, Israel has an incredibly effective air defense system. Most of these missiles are being shot down. So there has been relatively limited casualties here and relatively limited damage. But there is a psychological impact on Israelis who have been living through war for the last 2 years. You know, people are waking up in the night with their kids fearful, the sirens going off. So if this war goes on longer, the support, which I think Prime Minister Netanyahu has, it could begin to dwindle. And the question for the Prime Minister of Israel, I think, is, well, look, they might be winning militarily, but what's the end game? He has said again last night that he wants regime change in Iran, and he expects and hopes the Iranian people will rise up to topple the government. Well, there's no sign of that happening yet. And if it doesn't happen, and if we remain with a similar regime in place, albeit with a different supreme leader, then we could just find ourselves in this situation in, 1-2 years' time again.
John, thank you. Well, Israel says it's expanding the scale and scope of its bombing campaign against the Iran-backed militant group Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. The conflict has forced hundreds of thousands of people to leave their homes, and the Lebanese Health Ministry says that 773 people have been killed by Israeli strikes. Our correspondent Weir Davis is in Beirut and has more.
Israel has today dropped hundreds of these leaflets, these two-sided leaflets, over Beirut. Interestingly, not over parts of the city that are known to be particularly loyal to Hezbollah. And these leaflets are looking to capitalise on the quite obvious divisions in Lebanese society about the ongoing war with Israel. This leaflet urges people to perhaps come up with information that might ultimately lead to the disarmament of Hezbollah. It even gives a QR code that people can scan. But interestingly, this, like many leaflets we've seen, has been ripped and people are being told not to scan the QR codes. And most people we've been speaking to don't really think much about these at all.
If they wanted this to affect us, it would have long ago. No matter what they do, we remain steadfast, working, carrying on with our lives, and earning our livelihood.
We were sitting when we heard a very loud sound, like a strike. We looked up and saw 2 batches of leaflets being dropped, one in front of us and another further ahead. There were a lot. You could say about the size of a car. That's how many there were.
Well, the impact of the war continues to be felt across the Middle East. The US has confirmed that all 6 servicemen on board a plane that crashed in western Iraq yesterday died in that incident, which was not a result of hostile or friendly fire. Well, joining me now from Iraqi Kurdistan, the capital of Erbil, the capital of Iraqi Kurdistan, is our Middle East correspondent, Hugo Bachega. Hugo, just fill us in on what more we know about that incident.
Yeah, Mariam, so the US military is saying that the circumstances of this incident are still under investigation. But as you say, they also said that this was not the result of enemy or friendly fire. Now, this happened in western Iraq. A second aircraft was involved in this incident. It landed safely. So I think here the possibility is that this was a mid-air collision. Now, this means that at least 13 US service members have been killed since since the beginning of the war. Now, here in northern Iraq, a French soldier was killed in a drone attack that President Macron described as unacceptable. Now, this is the latest attack involving international forces based in this part of Iraq. France, the UK, the US, a number of countries are based here as part of the international coalition fighting the Islamic State group. And today, Italy said it would pull out its troops from Iraq after their base was hit in a separate attack. Now, these attacks by Iran, by Iranian-backed militias in Iraq have intensified since the beginning of the war. And here in Erbil, we've seen in recent days a number of drones being intercepted. And a key target has been the airport, where the US military base is located. And that's one of the reasons why the airport here remains closed.
Hugo, thank you. Some other developments now to bring you from today. Questions mount for the Secretary of Defence, Pete Hegseth, over possible US involvement in the strike on an Iranian school which killed 168 people, including 110 children. Mr. Hegseth said today that the US military has designated an officer to complete a probe on the strike. Iran continues to attack its neighbours in the region. A skyscraper in Dubai is hit by debris from an intercepted drone. Officials say it caused minor damage to the facade of the building. Met Police say conditions have been imposed on the Al-Quds Day protest and counter-protest in London this weekend. Marches will be banned, with both demonstrations limited to separate fixed areas on either side of the River Thames. Next month's Bahrain and Saudi Arabia Formula One Grand Prix are set to be cancelled over the weekend due to the conflict in the Middle East. An official announcement is expected by Monday, with the March 20th deadline looming for freight that has to be transported to Bahrain. Well, tomorrow marks 2 weeks since the start of this conflict, 2 weeks since that rallying cry from President Trump to Iranian protesters to take over the government. Well, 2 weeks in, that now looks like an increasingly remote prospect. To the Americans, this is Operation Epic Fury, but much of that anger has come from somewhere the Americans didn't expect. It's allies here in the Gulf states, like Qatar, where I am now. They've become embroiled in a war they were desperate to avoid, and their anger is pointed squarely at Iran, whose attacks are doing so much damage here. And what about Iran itself? Well, we heard today of the increasing pain and anger of those living there. Arguably, of all the countries involved in this conflict, it was the most prepared. Years of being part of the so-called axis of evil has taught this pariah state to be ready for any eventuality. And the strategy so far of causing as much havoc as possible has helped prolong the conflict. The regime in Iran is far more emboldened and resilient than anyone could have predicted. What is clear, though, is that the repercussions of this war are increasingly complex and unpredictable, and what happens over the next 2 weeks will have lasting implications for the Middle East and indeed the wider world. Well, whether you're joining us on YouTube, on TikTok, on Sounds, radio or TV, thanks so much for your time. We're back at the same time tomorrow with the Iran War Today.